All right. Name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God. All right. So let's kind of recap because this is our season end for Judges. So Judges, just make sure we're all on the same page, comes in between the period of time between Joshua and the Canaan conquest and before the monarchies, which really begins with Saul, right? Saul, then David, then Solomon. Those are the monarchies of the kingdom. The big issue in the book of Judges is as Joshua was told to conquer the land, they divvied up the land among the 12 tribes, and they were said, okay, go and rid the land of the inhabitants. And the people of Canaan were idol worshippers. We hear a lot about Baal. We hear about Ashtoreth. So Baal was considered the male god. Ashtoreth was a female god. There was a ton of child sacrifices that were going on, a ton of sexual immorality between these two gods and the inhabitants. So the Lord was saying, rid the land of it, right? And he knew that was key because they were weak, the Israelites were weak, and had they just settled there, they would have been influenced. And that's exactly what happened, is they ended up being strongly influenced by the idol worship. And the book of Judges has this ongoing cycle, right? The cycle is they fell away from God, then they were under the impression of the people, which were either the Midianites or the Philistines. Like every judge kind of had a struggle with a different group, and the people would cry out because of the oppression. God would hear them, he would send the judge would free them, and for the lifetime of the judge, there was peace. But once the judge died, then there was hardship again, and the children of Israel would fall away from God. When we talk about judges, these weren't people who were legal minded at all. They were charismatic military leaders. Each one had a little bit of pizzazz of their own, and they led the Israelites to victory. So they were military leaders, but each one, as we've looked at, had like something very, very like off about them, right? Each one has their own quirks. Each one, struggled. When we looked last week at Gideon, we saw the person Gideon who was a fearful individual who, over time, God, made fearless and a strong military leader. But we saw one of the big hurdles he had to overcome was this trust issue with God, and we looked at that in detail last week. But at the end, we see Gideon just kind of like falling flat on his face, because with the spoils from the war, he made, if you were here for our kind of pre-Bible study discussion, he ended up making this golden ephod, which is unclear as to exactly what it is, but people started to, play to it, and it became a way that they fell away from God. So every leader was kind of uniquely quirky, so to speak. And they each had their Achilles heel, which drew them away from God. And so this week, we're going to look at the other famous judge, which is Samson. Okay. And we love the story growing up. Like, this is one of the greatest stories to tell the kids, like in Sunday school. But when you're an adult and you read the story, you're like, this is really like weird story, right? And it's always kind of like, you're like, okay, this was a judge, like this was a man of God, like, but God was using them, right? For as broken as they were, God was still using them. So kind of questions to get us warmed up. What do you think, like, what are things that tend to stop us from reaching our spiritual potential? We all have this like potential in our relationship with God. What are things that tend to become a stumbling block or pose like a challenge in reaching our spiritual potential?
Sin.
That's an easy one. That's an easy one.
Low-hanging fruit.
Low-hanging fruit. Sin is off the board, guys.
I would say submission is another one. We don't necessarily want to submit to God or to anyone else for that matter.
That's a good one. Struggle to submitting to him.
Preoccupation with other things.
So we're busy doing those other things.
Trust or lack thereof.
So we missed the first part of what you said, Matthew.
Trust.
Trust. Okay, gotcha. What else?
Laziness.
Lazy.
Fear. I'd say fear is a pretty big, especially of other people.
Oh, say that again.
I would say fear is a pretty big one too, especially of other people.
Okay.
What other people think.
Okay. Okay. Next question. When you hear like this term passions of the heart, what do you think of? Food. Food. Okay, so what would be the passion towards food? Gluttony. Right? What are the passion? Like, what are passions of the heart?
I would say passions are strong desires, perhaps even innate or biological, if they're not trained properly, will lead to sin or self-harm.
So just kind of deep yearnings that we have, innate yearnings, that if untrained, can kind of run wild and make a muck of things. What are other passions of the heart?
Talking about Samson, lust.
Lust,
Yeah.
right? Lust,
Like Pharisees, they want to be righteous at all times.
like self, like vainglory. Yeah. So like these passions of the heart, like, as we were saying earlier, like if they go unchecked, can really, really like cause a problem for us, right?
Blind the eyes around them, obvious facts around them.
No. So I wanted to keep that in mind as we dive into the story of Samson, right? Because Samson is a character who we're going to see, like any judge, has this potential for a very close relationship with God. But the passions of his heart, or the untamed passions, like get the best of it, right? And there's always this like, could this be? No, he messed it up, right? This is the cycle of Samson, just like it is with many of the judges. So keep that in mind as we dive into Samson, because as much as like we're picking on Samson today, so to speak, and looking at him, all of us are a bit in the same boat, right? Where we all have an untamed passion somewhere floating in our hearts and our minds that when it goes unchecked, right, can really wreak havoc on our relationship with God. Right, so to begin with Samson, he's covered over 13, 14, 15, and 16. We're going to read sections of this. Hopefully we'll get through it all today. So we'll read big sections all together. Sorry again, the slides. I don't know why my Zoom is crashing, but make sure you have your Bibles with you. But we'll look at 13. Chapter 13, we're going to look at, I'll get us started by looking at verses 1 through 5. Okay. Again, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Now there was a certain man from Zorah of the family of the Danites, which is the tribe of Dan, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "Indeed, now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now therefore, please be careful not to drink wine or a similar drink, and not to eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head. For this child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." Right? So again, we're getting that verbiage in the first verse of the repeating pattern of Israel, right? Samson's birth is foretold of to the wife of Manoah, who is barren, and the parents seem to be God-fearing parents, okay? And we've seen this pattern before in scripture, right? Somebody's barren for a long time, God visits them, and then they have a child, right? We see that Abraham and Sarah, we see that with Zacharias and Elizabeth. So this is not like a new scenario, so to speak, right? But part of this is that in verse 5, it says, "For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines." Right? What's the vow of a Nazarite? And where else do we read this?
It's in the book of Acts.
Okay.
The people had taken like a vow to kill Paul at one point. Was that Nazarene vow?
No. Paul took the Nazarite vow. People who wanted to kill Paul took a vow not to eat
Not to
until
eat,
they
yeah,
called.
there we go.
That was a Nazarite vow, all right? But the Nazarite vow, so Paul took a Nazarite vow. Who's another person that you could think of that took a Nazarite vow? You've heard of that? John the Baptist, right? Because what is in the Nazarite vow? Don't cut your hair. Don't drink like strong drink, right? That was the Nazarite vow. And so St. John the Baptist and St. Paul both took a vow, but they did it differently. St. John the Baptist took a vow to be a Nazarite his entire life, right? So he's wearing a camel skin, never drink strong drink. So he did a lifetime. But a Nazarite vow, Paul used for a brief period of time, a season, a way to like rededicate himself to God. So when we look at this vow, it can be used by anybody who wants to draw close to God, right? Either for their entire lives or a season, right? Similar to like the monks, they take a vow when they go into the monastery for the rest of their lives, right? So we can make vows, but Nazarite vow could be used lifelong, could be used temporary, right? And right now we're told that from his birth, the mother is going to take this vow, but then Samson should carry it out, right? And you know, big part of the story is that no razor will come to his head. We don't get much of a drinking like undertone in this story, but the main part is his head. So is his hair. So that's what kind of gets us started. And I'm gonna like summarize the rest of chapter 13 because it's a simple story, but essentially the wife comes back, you know, after meeting the angel of the Lord, says to her husband Manoah, said like, I met the angel of the Lord. He said this and this and this. And he's like, are you sure you got all this information? And so he, you know, pleaded to God, saying, let us meet the same angel of the Lord again. And the request was answered. The angel of the Lord came back to Manoah's wife. And at the time she ran in, got her husband, came back. They kind of asked, you know, some additional questions to just make sure that what she heard was right. And Manoah ended up believing. And so he said, okay, well, let me get a sacrifice for you. He made a burnt offering, which the angel said, no, this burnt offering should not be to me, but should be to God. And as the burnt offering was happening, the angel of the Lord kind of went up with the flames of the offering, right? And Manoah has like a very like emotional reaction to this scene of the angel going up, and he says, oh man, we're toast because we saw the Lord. And his wife kind of talks some sense into him and says like, okay, that doesn't make sense because why would we be dead if the Lord just came and said you're going to have a child who's going to free? So the wife was logical, the man was illogical. That's what chapter 13 holds for us. Okay. Now let's jump into 14 because we see Samson's life unfold. Okay. And in Samson's life, it's interesting because, you know, 13 paints this picture of like, this is going to be somebody very, very special, right? Who was preordained by God to come and save the Israelites from the oppression of the Philistines. Somebody read verses 1 through 3 of chapter 14.
Okay. Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. And his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumscribed Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well.
Right? So this is a total abrupt change. Like you're expecting like a godly person, and the first thing he's doing is breaking the law, of Moses, where he's going to the outside of the children, right, of Israel in order to find a wife. And it's just like it's doubly insulting because one of the things that is killing the Israelites is they're mixing with the Canaanites. And Samson's first like introduction beyond like the enunciation of his birth is to go and find a wife, right? So we're off to a great start with Samson. Let's read I'll just read verse 4 actually, where it says, but his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel, right? So this is like an interesting verse, and I think it's a confusing verse. So I'm going to read it one more time. It says, but his father and mother did not know that it was the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. I want to know, like, when you read this verse, what does it make you feel and what does it make you think of?
Joseph,
Okay.
you meant it for evil, but the Lord intended it for good, or turned it to good.
So like, yeah, at the very end, like the brothers meant something bad, but he used it for good. Okay. What else? What are other reactions that we have to this verse?
I was just thinking when it says he was seeking to confront the Philistines, it's almost as if he's plotting something. He's almost like using something bad for more trouble to achieve his purposes, basically. I guess he's very active. He's not passive at all.
You're saying
For the Israelites to get their act together.
you're saying God is using?
It seems God using like something that's potentially evil
Okay.
for good, but he's also seems very active, and he's not necessarily waiting for the Israelites to get their act together. In fact,
Okay.
he's doing it through Samson not getting his act together.
The reason why I highlighted this is like, I think at face value, one of the ways you can read this is like kind of this image of like a puppet, like Samson is now just a puppet of the Lord. And so like he's using Samson's like love for women, like in order to get back at the Philistines. Like I think this verse has the potential to paint like a very negative picture about God and how he deals with us, right? And whenever we see verses like this, right, I think it's important for us to recenter ourselves on things that we know about God, right? And what we know about God, actually, I should have pulled the verse where he does not tempt us. Like he desires good from us. He desires to bring us to him. He doesn't like send us out and says, oh, like, I want you to be tempted. Right? He may allow temptation, but he's not the one actually doing the temptation, because his desire is to bring us in, not like to lose us. So it goes against his nature to do something bad. I think that one of the ways that you could read this verse, right, is that he's like sending Samson out, right, in this love affair just because he wants to strike the Philistines. And I want to make sure like that is not like the scenario.
Yeah, because if he didn't do so, God can find many ways to strike Philistine except this way. He just
Agreed.
fixed the situation that Samson put himself in by making something good of the situation that was ruined from the beginning because of Samson's mistake. Like he can otherwise.
Yeah. No, I like what you said. That like, I mean, he can attack the Philistines in many different ways,
Yeah.
right? But this is what Samson decided to do. So it's actually God like respecting the free will of the person and he's making a foolish choice. But the Lord is like, okay, but the main goal here of his life is to use his life in order to free the Israelites from the Philistines. This is the movie he's going to make. We'll make the best of it, right? So, and this is where, you look at this story and you see like what a beautiful beginning to Samson's birth, but then like Samson has to learn how to tame the passions of his heart, right? And this untamed passion of his is really going to get him in trouble, and that trouble is going to get worse like as time goes on. All right. Can somebody read verses 6 through 8 of chapter 14?
And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he tore the line apart as one would have torn apart a young goat.
Oh, sorry, just to preface it. So he's on his way to Timnah, and along the way, the famous story of the lion, right? So the lion comes out, and then that's why it's saying like, and he tore the lion apart. Sorry, go ahead.
Though he had nothing in his hand, but he didn't tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. After some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. He took some of it in his hand and went along eating. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some of them, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion.
Great, thank you. So this is the famous story of how he defeated the lion, and then several, weeks later or something like that, he's passing by, went to go see the carcass, and honey's coming out of it because a swarm of bees have set up shop there, right? And so if we kind of fast forward a little bit from this story, Samson and his father go down to Timnah, and a feast is, party, feast, whatever, is thrown. And we get this picture that 30 companions are there. I don't want to dwell on like who are these companions, but Samson and them decide to have a bit of a wager, right? And so Samson and the wager has to do with like, well, I'm going to tell you a riddle. If you figure out the riddle, I'll give you 30 pieces of clothing. If you don't figure out the riddle over the course of 7 days, you give me 30 pieces. And Lord knows Samson was probably a big guy, so finding clothing his size difficult in that day and age. They didn't have big and tall back then, so this was going to be hard for them. And to find 30 of them, even harder. So here's the riddle that Samson gives to them. In verse 14 to 16, it says, so he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong cup came something sweet. Now for 3 days they could not explain the riddle, but it came to pass on the 7th day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband, that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? Then Samson's wife wept on him and said, you only hate me, you don't love me, you opposed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me. And he said to her, look, I have not explained it to my father or my mother, so should I explain it to you? We'll continue to verse 18. Now she had wept on him 7 days, while their feast lasted. And it happened on the 7th day that he told her because she pressed him so much. Then she explained the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Right? So, Samson's wife pressed him, his first wife pressed him in order to get the answer to this issue, this riddle, and she shared it with her Philistines. Then they come back, they answer the riddle, so he's upset, and he's upset with her. But the point that I wanted just to think about is we're talking about Samson's untamed passion, right? And when we allow our untamed passions to continually run wild, right? They put us in situations that further expose weaknesses in us, right? When we allow our passions to continue to carry us down certain roads, it puts us in scenarios that further weakens us, right? And that's what we're seeing here. You know, Samson is being just kind of like slowly beaten down by his wife, right? Until he gives up the riddle. And then that leads to like his frustration, and it's this bad cycle, right? And so he has to go. What he does is he ends up killing 30 people to get their garments, and then he gives it to these companions, you know, and in this whole process, like he is frustrated, he's upset at his wife. His wife ends up being given away to his best man, and then to seek revenge on the whole situation. This, I think, is pretty cool. He finds 30 foxes and he ties the tail of 2 of them together. And in between each 2 is like a torch. And then he lets the foxes go into the harvest, right? And so he burns essentially the fields. And this sort of like mark against any group of people is a huge one, because to burn somebody's grain field is to take away like their sustenance. So it's to really put him like in a really, really bad situation. So he does this. And of course, like he like gets everybody really upset because of this. And so they're like enraged and they're asking like, okay, who did this? And eventually they figured out it was Samson. Can somebody read 6 through 8? Actually chapter 15, right? So the story kind of continues on to chapter 15. So chapter 15, 6 through 8.
I'll do it. When the Philistines asked, "Who did this?" they were told, "Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his friend." So the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death. Samson said to them, "Since you've acted like this, I won't stop until I get my revenge on you." He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Then he went down and stayed in a cave in the rock of Etam.
Right, right. So he gets upset, he slaughters them, and then he runs, right? And he ends up in this rock of Etam. And Etam is around Judah. And so he's kind of finding refuge, getting away from the situation. The Philistines chase him there and they surround Judah. And so Judah is like, why are the Philistines here? Right? And the Philistines are saying, well, we don't actually care for you. We just want Samson, who's hiding in the rock of Etam. So Judah goes up with 3,000 of their men in order to arrest Samson and turn him over. And so Samson kind of like negotiates with them, but essentially he says, as long as you're not going to kill me, I'll turn myself into you, and then you give me over to the Philistines, right? So that's where we're at in the story. And then I'll read kind of 14 through 19 because it kind of says what happens next. So when he came to Lehi, which is where the Philistines were, all right, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called the place Ramath Lehi. Then he became very thirsty, so he cried out to the Lord and said, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. Now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out and he drank, and his spirit returned and revived. Therefore he called its name En Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. Right? So what we're seeing here is like Samson is always responding negatively to a situation gone worse. It's, and it just gets like, it gets worse and worse as we go through. But there, we see this dance, if you will, between Samson's free will and God wanting to deliver his people from oppression. Right? It's such a delicate balance, so to speak, between the expression of his free will and God still like accomplishing the mission, which was freeing freeing the Israelites from the oppression of the Philistines. God is faithful to his people. He raised Samson for this purpose. And Samson, as his story is unfolding, has every opportunity to draw close to God. Like every time he's in battle, what do we see? The Spirit of the Lord is upon him. Then he gets, a burst of strength, and then he wins the battle. You would hope that eventually he would say, like, wow, God is really with me. Let me change my ways. But for some reason, like he's unable to curbside the passions in his heart, right? So he keeps on going and making yet another mistake, right? And chapter 16 just opens up with another love affair with a harlot that ends up with Samson like breaking the gates of the city and walking out after people are kind of surrounding him, wanting to kill him, right? It's just like one story after another with Samson. And now we finally get to, in chapter 16, his most famous, relationship, which is Delilah. There is no love in this relationship at all. This is like the worst relationship possible. And when you read it, right, which we'll read some of it, you have to be looking and saying like, oh my gosh, Samson, like wake up. So let's read just a little bit of it, because you read it and you're irritated at Samson. I'm irritated at Samson, okay? That he would act like this, all right? Somebody read 4 through 6.
Afterward, it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you.
So Samson, at this point, has allowed his passions to completely take over his sense of logic, right? When there's no change in our environment, in our passionate pursuits, eventually what happens is it erodes our values over time. Samson has no sense of values. Sadly to say, like, he's in this relationship. All she wants to know early on is like, where do you get your strength so that you may be bound? Like, okay, wake up, Samson. What do you think she's going for? Does she love you? Like, no, she don't love you, right? She wants money, right? And when you read, like, let's read verses 7 through 9, okay, which gives a picture of a repeating cycle with Samson. I'll go ahead and read it. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the Lord of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Right? I don't know about you, but I think the first episode of this cycle would tip him off, right? But it doesn't. So what do? Go through the cycle again. The next one is going to be, oh, if you tie me with new rope that has never tied anything before. Same thing. Tie him with new rope. Then Samson, the Philistines are here. And he wakes up and like breaks the rope and fights him off. Then weave the locks of my head into the web of a loom. I don't even know what a web of a loom is, but it sounds ridiculous anyway, right? And yet the same pattern happens, right? You look at this and you're like, there's nothing wholesome about this relationship. And for some reason, Samson can't clue in as to what she's trying to get at. And this speaks to it speaks to the power of passion. It speaks to how blinding passions can be. Right? And we can like reflect on, you know, ourselves and kind of think back to certain times in our lives where like people were really trying to talk logic to us. Right? Say, don't go down this path, don't be in this relationship, don't take this job, like don't hang out with this people. And what do? Like in our minds, like we figured it out, we know what we're doing, everything is fine. And we go down the path, we've completely like ignored logic, and we end up like doing something really stupid that either hurts somebody or hurts ourselves. Right? And a lot of it is driven by some sort of passion in our heart that just has this ability to dispel logic from the equation. Samson has no logic. A lot of strength, no logic. Like if there ever was a cliche that fit, all muscle, no brain, Samson, right? Samson fits the bill, all right? So let's look at 16 verses 15 and 17. It says, then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? It's like painful to read this, right? How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is. It came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, a razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man. Right? It's painful to read, but this was the situation. But now I want us to focus on when we think of his hair, right? His hair was a symbol of what?
Consecration to God.
Consecration to God, right? So the hair was an external symbol, an external practice, if you will, or an external rule that he followed, which was representative, or should have been representative, of something deep that is happening inside of it. So right now we have an external rule or sign, but the inside is empty. Right? If you were to think of a building, right, and you had the wall of a building, and the wall looked good, but inside there was no like floors, there were no supports, there was no like walls, there was nothing. How strong will the wall be?
Not very.
Not very, right? It collapses, right? So as much as like
It will not stand in strong wind. Or
it won't
any-
stand in a strong wind, any of the elements,
Mhm.
right? So the external supports the internal, and the internal supports the external, right? It works together. And that's the way our spiritual rules are. Because if you will, if you think of our own personal spiritual rules, they are an external framework for an internal relationship. External framework, right? How we pray, how we fast, how we tithe, how we take communion, confess, all these things. External framework for an internal relationship with God. Samson's hair and not drinking wine was an external framework for what should have been an internal relationship with God. And what we see is that now the internal relationship with God is gone. There's like, it's sad, like, but we don't get a sense of like any sort of like relationship with him beyond his hair and the strength that comes from his hair. And so when you have this mismatch, eventually what happens is the walls collapse. Right? And the same thing with us. Like when we do our rules, for example, but maybe we're not doing it well, and like our internal like relationship is weak, a lot of times what happens is we fold on our rules. And so when we look at Samson, like, okay, internally, there was nothing, there was a void. So what do we have is eventually a collapse external, which is why he gets to this point where, okay, there's no relationship with God, so why like continue to hide this? Like he's no longer protecting the secret of his strength, which was, symbolic of his relationship with God. Once that was empty, he gave away the secret of his strength, and we see the external collapse. Samson had every opportunity. By the work that God was doing through him, had every opportunity to turn the corner. But without the taming of passions, there was nothing. And now we just have a collapse. Right? And it's really important for us to think about that. Right? It's a tragedy in the story. But it's a tragedy we see time and time again. Right? It's a tragedy because sometimes as parents, we look at ourselves like, the way that I'm like parenting needs to change. Right? And despite like having multiple warnings, sometimes like not controlling either my anger or my frustration or my own passions, is that eventually it erodes the relationship with my kids. And we see it like later on in life, like parents who have a very, very distant, if even existent, relationship with their kids. And these are the parents who were probably warned, saying like, you've got to change, you've got to do something, right? The road that you're on is really bad. But they don't, right? What happens? It all collapses. We see this like when spouses don't struggle to learn to sacrifice for one another, eventually they go, no. And now the external shell of this marriage has no internal relationship to support it. And the marriage collapses, right? We see individuals who, like, for example, can't break this cycle of always being critical of other people. And they always have to like criticize. They always have like a comment, right? And people say like, I don't want to be your friend because you criticize me, right? You're always so judgmental. These are the ones who later on in life like find themselves alone. This, like, when we're unable to tame passions or behaviors, we end up collapsing later on. And that's what we have in Samson. But all of us are not immune to the same problem. And if you ask me, like, it's a tragedy in this story. There's so many opportunities, but he couldn't turn. Any thoughts? We're gonna wrap up in a couple minutes. Okay. So let's see. We'll pick it up 19. We'll read 19 and 21. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters and he became a grinder in the prison. Right? Like, what a waste. So sad. Right? And it kind of just takes us to the final act of Samson's life, where we have this scene where all the Philistine leaders have gathered to offer a sacrifice to Dagon, who was their god. And in their, the impetus behind their sacrifice has to do with Dagon subduing their enemies, right? Which Samson was their big enemy. And so they were kind of celebrating. And so to kind of flaunt it some more, they requested Samson to be brought out from prison in order to perform for them. And in verses 26 and 28, we really have like the last, scene in Samson's life, where it says, then Samson, he's led out by this young lad, so to speak, into the, the temple, wherever they are. And while this boy is close by, Samson says, then Samson said to the lad who led him by the hand, let me feel the pillars which support the temple so that I can lean on them. Now the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof watching while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O my God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Like, even read this last line, and you're like, okay, Samson's getting it, right? He's finally realized, like, God is the source of his strength, right? And he's asking God and saying, like, God provide me, God help me, right? To take one blow. But it's just kind of like, at the end, he's like, for my 2 eyes. Like, you forgot your whole mission, Samson, right? Your life was to help to free the Israelites from the Philistines. And even like in your last act, what you want is vengeance for your 2 eyes. So he's kind of like, he's missing it. He's kind of on because he's circled back towards God a bit and said, like, okay, just this once, God, please remember, right? We see that relationship starting to form. It's not totally there because of the whole eye comment, right? Just help me take vengeance for my eyes one last time, right? But he's turned for whatever degree, like we'll put on it. He turned and he learns some sort of lesson. And I know I'm kind of poking fun at Samson. Like, we're the same thing. Like, when we kind of get down in the dumps and we begin to, turn our lives back, it's not like all our motives are perfect, right? They're mixed, right? We want it partly for us. We want it partly because, like, we want to do right. We want to rebuild the relationship with God, but we're still like fighting off our passion. So like it's in there. I appreciate that from this text, But I think this last verse gives us a little bit of a picture of probably what could have been had Samson tamed his passion and really, sought God in all that he did and asked for his guidance as he was freeing, helping free the Israelites from the Philistines. He still got the job done because God is faithful to his people. But the way it happened is a bit of a tragedy, right? Could have been different. And God is faithful with us too. He sees our shortcomings, he sees our passions. And just like Sam, he still engages with us, right? He still wants to work in us and through us. But we have to work, right, on taming our passions, which is expressing our will and wanting to turn away from our passions. Similar to, like our conversation earlier. There's something you said, like,
glory to God, or contribute our victory, our
Yeah.
blessings to ourselves.
yeah, exactly. Like that whole conversation, like it's not always clear, right? But the greatest result comes when we acknowledge God's hand in all things. But Samson was leveraging his strength to get what he wanted. So he like, it was a confused picture. It's a mixed picture, but Samson's life could have been so different and so powerful beyond the physical strength. But it's those passions, right? And that's why, when we go into Lent, for example, right around the corner, and we're going to put all this effort into fasting, right? Which is going to teach us discipline. It's that same discipline that we want to leverage from fasting to apply towards the passions of our heart and say, well, passion of mine is to really get angry in situations. Well, I need that discipline to curb my anger. Passion is like to really become very greedy towards things. Well, I need that discipline to say, it's okay. I can be, happy with less. I can survive with less food. I can also be happy with less things, right? So we use this discipline in order to begin to tame the passions of our hearts in Lent. So, may God like prepare our hearts, prepare our minds for the season to come. And may we use the fast in order to begin to tame our passions, because it is killing and holding back the potential of our spiritual lives. Glory be to God forever. Any questions?
It reminds me of the story of Samson, the story of the Harris's Aries, and he was not, I think he was a priest, but because he followed himself and he believed he wasn't humble enough to listen to others.
Yeah.
And he ended up with making a heresy and dividing people and setting them in that.
Absolutely. It's been a long day. Please and prayer. Lord, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God, and we thank you, Lord, for your blessings this day, this time to look at your servant Samson. And help us to all see a part of ourselves in Samson. All of us struggle with different passions. But you, Lord, want to work with us and want to give us these opportunities to turn from our passions, to turn towards you. Lord, help us to learn that discipline through the different practices we bring into our lives, so that our external rule would really facilitate and allow an internal life in you to flourish, and be able to support one another, and allow us to grow and be firm in our relationship with you. Thank you, Lord, for this fast of Jonah. Ask, Lord, that you conclude it for us in peace tomorrow morning. Give us all rest tonight, our hearts for Lent to come. Through the intercessions of our saints here, as we say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the Lord. Christ, your Son, and his kingdom, forever and ever.